Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Tuesday night book study class. I think I explained last week what was going to happen this week, but in case I forgot, I can't clearly remember. We've been working on Swami's book, In Divine Friendship, his book of letters. We had like 59 classes, I think we had. I couldn't squeeze it to one more just to make it an even 60. So that book ended. And then simultaneously, for about a year or two, I've been doing an every other Friday webinar on this book, The Essence of the Bhagavad Gita, which is a kind of a big book too. And it was a 1 hour class, and I was doing it for Ananda Online. So when I finished Divine Friendship, we had the brilliant idea, Kesava had the brilliant idea, that this book would become the Tuesday night book, because that will, one, give us a better chance of ever finishing it, because this class meets every week. And so we are actually, just by coincidence, oh, isn't that adorable? We are on class number 61. So it's almost exactly the same number. But we're just going to start right in the middle. The Gita is pretty freestanding. Every verse can stand all on its own. And I believe if you go into my YouTube channel, you'll be able to figure out where the 60 classes are. And if there's anything I can do to make it easier for you, excuse me, if there's anything they can do to make it easier for you, I'll try to do that. This is my third time through this book. The first time I went all the way through it. It's an audio recording buried somewhere on Ananda Palo Alto, I think. And I set a 10-page per class schedule, which I swore I would never do that again. But I did go through the whole book. And then I started it again for India. And I was doing it at 6 in the morning so that it would be a comfortable time for India. And then we went into daylight savings time, and it turned into 5 in the morning. And Sai Ganesh, who was my techie, and I, after one really just terribly sleepy morning, decided that really wasn't a good plan. So there's a random sort of 10 or 12, 15 classes on that one. All of which is to say, here we are doing it again. It's the middle of a story, but it's the story of the soul's long journey from delusion into freedom. And we're all in the middle of the story, so I think it'll work out okay. We are actually at the end, toward the end of chapter 5 of the Gita of its 18 chapters. So with all that introduction, we'll have a prayer, we'll have a little chanting, and then we'll start. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Bless us with deep attunement, that the living power of this scripture may enter into our vibrations, that we may feel the divine grace that has made the Gita the backbone of spirituality for millions of people for thousands of years. Help us to be among the number whose lives are transformed by this immortal work. Om. Peace. Amen.
of sorrow 1,000 years or till tomorrow. In the valley of sorrow 1,000 years or till tomorrow. But I'll wait to see only you, just you. My Lord, I want to see only you, just you. My heart's aflame, my soul's afire. My heart's aflame, my soul's afire. Just for you, just you. My Lord, I want to see only you, sorrow 1,000 years or till tomorrow. In the valley of sorrow 1,000 years or till tomorrow. But I'll wait to see only you, just you. My Lord, I want to see only you, just you. My heart's aflame, my soul's on fire. My heart's aflame, my soul's afire. Just for you, just you. My Lord, I want to see only you, just you. In the valley of sorrow 1,000 years or till tomorrow. In the valley of sorrow 1,000 years or till tomorrow. But I'll wait to see only you, just you. My Lord, I want to see only you, just you. My heart's aflame, my soul's afire. My heart's aflame, my soul's afire. Just for you, just you. My Lord, I want to see only you, just you. In the valley of sorrow 1,000 years or till tomorrow. In the valley of sorrow 1,000 years or till tomorrow. But I'll wait to see only you, just you. My Lord, I want to see only you, just you. My Lord, I want to see only you, just you. My Lord, I want to see
Om, peace. Amen. All right. So we are up to this book, for those of you who are just joining us. The Bhagavad Gita itself has 18 chapters. Swami Kriyananda wrote the very big commentary. The actual Gita's tiny, 18 chapters and various stanzas, but the commentary is long. What was the word I was trying to say? Oh, so Swami has his own chapter titles, which are, there's more, I believe, chapters in the book than there are chapters in the Gita, just to confirm that. So sometimes it's Swami's chapter. Yes, Swami's book has 31 chapters. So the 18 don't always match. So we are in the chapter called Freedom Through Inner Renunciation, which is chapter 5 of the Gita and chapter 12 or something of the book, something like that. Chapter 17 of the book. And we are on stanza 21 of the Gita. And this particular section of chapter 5, he has like 11 and 12 verses without any commentary. So I'll be reading more verses than I will sometimes. I've been having a really wonderful experience sharing this book with all of you, which is always the nicest kind of teaching, is when I'm just as engaged, and it's all new to me too. Not that I've never read it before, but I've come to a profound appreciation of what the power of Scripture is. It's like it's a living relationship. I remember people, of course, who are very dedicated to Jesus in that kind of Jesus is the only one sort of way, and they will just read the Bible. You would see, especially young people, who would just carry the Bible around, and it would be all marked up, and they'd be reading it all the time. And it always used to puzzle me until I started reading the Bible. And then it's like every time you would open it up, you'd be in relationship with Jesus. And Jesus' consciousness was is so immense that even if you're reading words that you may have read before, it's an in-the-moment relationship with his consciousness, which is, of course, exactly what the Gita is. The Gita has a pleasant advantage to my experience over the Bible, even though I love the New Testament, because the teaching in the Gita is more direct. The Bible is about Jesus, but the teaching isn't as explicitly and as easily stated as it is in the Gita. So the Gita just gives you these constant ideas that you just have to consider over and over again. So where we are right now is inner renunciation, which of course has been a very fundamental principle for a really long time in my spiritual life. But all of a sudden I'm beginning to understand what it means, like this actual real fact that the inner and the outer world are completely different from each other. I know that doesn't sound very profound, but it sounds more profound when you actually get a real insight. I remember many years ago, my friend Shivani, she and I are peers. We're both founding members of Ananda Village. And then for pretty much all the time that I've been living in Palo Alto working with this community, she's been in Italy developing the community there for Ananda. So we're we're colleagues. We're sisters, soul sisters. But in any case, I remember once she went into seclusion, and after, it was a longish seclusion, 10 days or 2 weeks, and when she came out, she said to me, when you pray to God, He answers. And I was being a little flippant. I said, well, Shivani, that is a really fundamental idea. So you had to go into that long seclusion to come back with that. But she was having none of it from me. She stayed completely like this, and she said, Asha, it's true. Just like that. And I suddenly understood what she meant. Yeah, we'd both been sharing these teachings together in lots of different settings. But there comes a moment where all of a sudden you realize what you've been saying, and something else enters into you. So I found both in reading the New Testament and also, of course, in reading this scripture, that it just keeps happening to me that all of a sudden I have a little more of a glimpse of what Krishna's trying to tell us, which is why we keep going back. I mean, this, I said, is my third time. My second time going to be all the way through this book. But Swami did let me think. He at least did 2 complete series of programs on the Bhagavad Gita that are on the internet, at least twice. And Master said that his commentary, the Yogananda's commentary on the Gita, would bring millions of people to God. And Master said, I know, I have seen it. The manuscript that Swamiji saw when Master wrote it in 1951 and 52, Swamiji felt that that manuscript had the magnetism to do that. As Self-Realization Fellowship published a 2-volume version that they created from that manuscript, Swami did not feel that the essential magnetism of Master was present to the same degree in that publication. So in 2006, he felt guided by Master to write this version, which is not from the manuscript in the sense of going through like this, but I've said this before, but it's an important thought. Swami said when he finally started writing this, and he'd been waiting since 1952 to work on this commentary because Master told him to, he felt he could remember stanza for stanza what Master said, how Master interpreted every stanza. So he didn't have the writing of Master, but he had all of the teaching of Master. That's why he calls it the essence of the Bhagavad Gita, explained by Paramahansa Yogananda as remembered by his disciple, Swami Kriyananda, meaning he wasn't looking at the paper, but he remembered it. And it was a grace that Master gave him. So anyway, here we are. So chapter 5, verse 21 of the Bhagavad Gita. Feeling no attraction to the sense, I should also say that Swamiji, Master made a literal translation of the Bhagavad Gita. So this is also a different translation. It's a unique translation to, I don't know whether SRF uses these exact words or not, but it's based on Master's literal translation of the verses. Feeling no attraction to the sensory world, either subtle or gross, the yogi lives in the ever-new joy of his own being. United to spirit, he attains the perfection of absolute bliss. I love how unequivocal the Gita's commentary is. It's not saying you're going to be a little happier. It's saying, and it's partly, that is the point of the Gita that I'm really absorbing on a deeper level. Swamiji says the difference between deeply asleep and then waking up to this world is if you've been very sound asleep and then you come in, to wakefulness, and you have to, the difference between those realities, he said, doesn't begin to illustrate the difference between ordinary consciousness and divine self-realization, perfect realization. He uses the word, he attains the perfection of absolute bliss. I mean, just those two words, absolute bliss. Bliss itself is already a much bigger word than happiness or pleasure or comfort or enjoyment or even joy, because joy can be related to many things. You know, we can rejoice because our competitor has now been pushed outside and is no longer going to be a competitor. I mean, we can apply the word, people do apply the word joy to many lesser realities, but the word bliss is generally saved for the word ananda, which means the divine bliss, that which has no opposite, absolute bliss. So nothing, absolutely nothing, can move us off of that. Even to consider the possibility of such a reality, because we live in this ever-changing world of duality, where the wave goes up and the wave goes down and the wave goes up. But he says, and of course here's the hard part, feeling no attraction to the sensory world. And all of us are living in the sensory world all the time. Just we open our eyes and we see and we feel and we hear and we touch and in some ways we taste. These are all the senses that hold this experience together and persuade us that this is where we need to be. And, you know, we're always being attracted to something or another in the sensory world. I'm thirsty, I'm hungry, I'm restless, I itch, you know, whatever it might be, something is happening. I don't like the view out my window, I'm going to close my curtain. We're always like this. But what if we felt no attraction? Just none. It's just like nothing that I can experience through the agency of my physical body, whether gross or subtle, it just doesn't interest me. And it doesn't interest me not because I've become so dull and apathetic that I just don't care. It's because I am constantly engaged with a level of absolute bliss that would be diminished if I came in and did. I mean, think of the most pleasurable thing you can imagine, the most enjoyable thing you can imagine that you experience through the senses, and just with the power of imagination, imagine being so caught up inside oneself with absolute bliss, with unity with the Spirit, that there's no inclination. See, that's what we're working with everything about the Gita and everything about the path of self-realization. It's not a dogma that says we ought to do this. It's a method by which we will shift our own awareness to the point where, well, in Autobiography of a Yogi, when Master was visiting the, which Swami was it? Wasn't the perfume? I can't remember which one it was, but he had been a very wealthy man, and he had been born into a very wealthy family, and he had renounced all his wealth in order to become a yogi. And when Yogananda said to him something, I understand, sir, that you gave up great wealth for the spiritual path, and he said, you know, a handful of rupees for an eternity of bliss. It's like, what, a handful of rupees, what does that mean to me? I didn't give up anything. I embraced a far greater reality. One of the phrases I remember from this book that Swami had published in the late 60s, which was just bits and pieces from his lectures. And he had the phrase, "This then to me is renunciation, to kick aside all limitation and embrace infinity." And interestingly, after all these years, I still remember that because it's so the opposite. But it's not, people think that if I give up the external world and the world of the senses that I'm enjoying, I'll be deprived. And the opposite is so. It's that I will be enriched to such an extent that what would I want with a handful of rupees? And then all the commentary and the whole Gita is, oh, how do I do that? But it has to start with some intuitive belief that such a thing is desirable, and then that can't be that can't be faked. That just, it arises in your heart, and it arises in our heart from our experience of this world. We chase and we grab and we try to hold the wave at the peak and have it never go down. And it always goes down. And how many lifetimes we go through it until it begins to occur to us that there's another alternative. The intuition arises that on a deeper level that there is another reality that I need to find, and then faith gradually grows in us that it's findable, and therefore it's worth making the effort. I mean, even in the Gita, Arjuna says, what if I give up this world and live without the pleasures, I'm paraphrasing, but what if I live without the pleasures of this world, live a life of denial, but don't actually realize God, and I just die and at the end of this incarnation, I've neither enjoyed the world nor have I found God. And that's where Krishna answers, my devotee is never lost. Whatever effort you make to expand your awareness, that is the only thing you take away from this world. The only thing we take from this world is whatever consciousness we've developed, whatever energy pattern we have cultivated in this incarnation in the chakras. Wherever we have stored up energy in the chakras, whether it's on a gross sensual level or on a very refined spiritual level, that pattern is who we are. More than anything else, that's who we are. That goes into the astral world with us. That determines our next incarnation. I remember saying to Swami, this was very early because I was trying to just understand, because where I ended up in my early 20s, which was living out in the country under very primitive conditions in this ashram, in this fledgling community with this wonderful Indian teacher, American teacher, but the teachings of India, with all these wonderful brothers and sisters, everything about it. There was no part of me that could have anticipated my doing that. Oh, and then I joined the monastery, whereas I'd always planned to marry and have bunches of children, and now I was making a commitment to being a monastic. I took an interlude out of that for marriage and then have come back to that life, but nonetheless, the children never manifested. Nothing that I thought was going to manifest, except everything manifested. I just was, the form it took, there was no part of me that could have imagined it because I didn't know such a thing existed. But I was always searching so hard for truth. And I said to Swamiji, I have this desperate desire to know, to understand the secret of happiness, as I called it. And I said, but I've always been happy. I've not suffered. Nothing bad has ever happened to me. And he just said, past lives. Past lives, of course. And now, of an age that I am, I won't say that I've suffered. I've had bad days. Everybody has bad days. I won't say I've suffered in the sense that ever since I came to the spiritual path, well, this is how I mean it. Swamiji, I was in India with him as it happened. It didn't matter where we were. And this woman had come to see him for a satsang, and she wanted to ask a question, and she says, you know, my brother this, my mother-in-law that, my husband this, my children this, you know, it was all sort of like, it was all in English, but it didn't matter, the tone was, and Swami said, well, the good thing about being a disciple, which he was on the spiritual path, is that even though these challenges come, we know that God is behind it, and we know that it's all for our greater good. She said, like this, the whole story all over again. He said it to her a second time, and the third time when she started doing that, he said something courteous, but he didn't try to tell her 3 times. So I've been the opposite, is what I would say. It's like challenges have been there aplenty, but it's nothing compared to what life was like before I met Swami. Once I saw that there is a way out, that there are people who have understood, truly understood, how to live. Not merely how to be successful in this world, how to get by, but really have understood how to live. Everything else, no matter how agonizing it might be in the moment, and I've had my moments, but I know why. So I don't have to just repeat the sort of lament of, you know, what can I do? I know what I can do. I can just hold on. So first you have to have the intuition that it even exists, and then you have to have the faith that if I stick with this, freedom will come. And that faith is built on experience. All of it's built on experience. And we just have to move. We have to move in our own level of reality. We can't assume someone else's confidence if we don't have it. Other people's confidence can strengthen us in our own, but we have to just move step by step until we feel no attraction for the sensory world, because we are united in spirit and in a state of absolute bliss. Chapter 5, verse 22. O son of Kunti, Kunti was Arjuna's mother, so O son of Kunti, Arjuna, because sense pleasures spring from outside the self, they all have a beginning and an end and bring only misery. That's a pretty strong statement, isn't it? No one of any understanding would seek happiness through them. I love that. No one of any understanding. Anybody who knows anything would never do that. That's just how it looks from Krishna's point of view. And this was actually the verse that I was very much struck by when I was reviewing the book before class yesterday. Pleasures spring from outside the self, capital S self. They all have a beginning and an end and bring only misery, because it's not really who we are. So this is the the waking into superconsciousness. This is like, who am I? There are spiritual paths where essentially the entire spiritual practice is just a continuing, ever deepening, asking and answering of the question, who am I? And most of us answer with our name. You know, this is my name. I'm Asha Nayaswami. And then we add characteristics. I live in this place. I'm of a certain age. I'm a gender, this reality. Sometimes I say, I'm sort of trying to find the right language. I no longer say I'm Jewish. I try to say I was raised in a Jewish family. I mean, just trying to find ways. And I puzzle at the fact even that I still identify with the concept of being Jewish. Although interestingly, I've been working to disidentify with it. Going to Israel like 4 times in the last 5 years brought it a lot to the fore. But nonetheless, all of those different things that we answer, what is myself? And so what the Gita is saying, what Krishna is saying to Arjuna, is that all of this, he uses the word sense pleasures, but it's all of this that we perceive. There is someone perceiving it. We tend to think that what we're perceiving is our reality. Even I hold up my hand and I see my hand. And this hand I have a certain relationship to it. One of Swamiji's suggestions for spiritual freedom, as he says, is to think often about the transitory nature of this body that we live in. He says when you're washing your arm in the shower, just think about how extraneous this is to our real self, and that eventually it's just going to be dust, literally. But that doesn't mean that I will be dust. And people have had all these near-death experiences now give us this super vivid picture of how the body is so separate from the self, and that the self can be conscious and aware, and the body can be completely inert. I mean, I'm sure you at least have the opportunity, if you're interested, to read so many fascinating stories about how the body is just sitting there, and I am going all over the place, just going downstairs in the hospital, going outside, traveling great distances to visit other relatives, entering other realms where everything is completely different, except that I am still there. So, am I these sensory pleasures and experiences that I'm always feeling myself drawn to? And so our Krishna just makes, the unequivocal statement. The Gita is very unequivocal. It doesn't say, maybe you might consider, perhaps if you feel to. Krishna just goes just like that. That's exactly what he says. Sense pleasures are something that happen outside of us. I never make the mistake. I'm quite fond of this sweater, and I wear it often. It's a nice color, and I like cashmere, and it was a gift, and I like it just splendidly. But I take it off at night, and I don't have any sense of personal loss. It's just the sweater, and I am fond of it, and I do like wearing it. It keeps me warm. Many positive things about it. But if anybody asked me, who are you? I wouldn't say that I'm this blue sweater. But the body, we take just the same. It was a monastic tradition. Certain monks would follow. They would literally get a human skull and use it like a cup. Just drink, their water or the wine with their meal out of a bone cup that was a human skull. Now, people can think of that as just being horrible, but it was to just be a constant reminder that who am I? What is the self? And all of these, quote, sense pleasures, sensory perceptions, all of them are dependent on the body. Without a physical body, but what I was starting to say, but there's somebody who's always watching, isn't there? There's somebody inside who's having those experiences. So who is that? There's this continuous, in the same context, the mental chatter that we have. Somebody's talking to us and telling us stuff and thinking about what we should do, but somebody else is always listening. We hear those thoughts, but they're spoken to us. We listen to them. So who's listening? And it's so much fun when you really get interested in it. Who's listening? And it's so much fun when we start getting drawn in this direction or that direction to just stop and think. Because sense pleasures spring from outside the self, they all have a beginning and an end and bring only misery. That's a pretty strong statement, bring only misery. Not even a little pleasure for a little while, but it's the wave goes up and the wave goes down. And in the end, if we hold on to it too much. And I see people, I have seen people in my life who define themselves by something so transitory. And then that begins to leave them. You see this with women who are movie stars, and they've traded so much on the body and the face that they have. And, the difference between a young woman and an old woman almost always is pretty startling. I presume, well, I mean, if I didn't die young, I've grown old quite a few times, and I think I've been in female bodies before, but every so often I see a picture of myself from 40 or 50 years ago, and I think, wow, what a trick. What a weird and strange trick. I understand, this fascinates me. In Autobiography of a Yogi, when Sri Yukteswar, Master's Guru, comes back from the resurrection of Sri Yukteswar, Sri Yukteswar says, in the astral world, almost everyone, because in the astral world, you manifest a form, a visible form, but it's your own thoughts. You can manifest whatever form that it is. Our own thoughts now too. Just on the material plane, I guess it's a little harder to shift. On the astral plane, it's easier to shift. This is how Sri Yukteswar explains it. And he said most people make a visible form that is about 25 years old. The first time I read that, I thought, isn't that interesting? So there is, because here I am. I've been a yogi since I was 24. And even when I was a younger person, I've never been, I never focused much on youth or feminine beauty. I didn't particularly think I had youth, but I didn't think I had much beauty. I just never thought it would get me anywhere. It just never occurred to me. One time in my life, my friend Paula was running Mountain Song, which was a gift and clothing store, mostly women's clothes, and every year they put on this fashion show. And one year I was a model for her fashion show. And there's a few pictures of me around it was really great fun. And it was the only time in my life I ever did anything just because I was a girl. However, given all of that, and I paid attention when I started becoming a public person, because, especially when I moved into this area, because this is what people expect. And if you're a young woman and you look terrible all the time, in this society, in this area, people will not take you seriously. You don't have to look glamorous, but you at least have to look like you can tell what colors match. So I put myself in the hands of a very gifted stylist. She told me exactly what to do, and I just did it. And it worked pretty well, looking at the pictures. But coming to the end of all of that, when I began to age, it bothered me. I was just stunned. I couldn't believe it, but it actually bothered me. And for about 5 years, I never had my hair cut by the same hairdresser, because I thought it was their fault. All women who are older than maybe 50 know exactly what I'm talking about. So I get 1 or 2 haircuts maybe, and then I'd go find someone else. And finally somebody just told me the truth, that it really wasn't the stylist's fault. It was that I had aged. But it bothered me. And I'm just going to tell a story on my friend Shivani, because I think it's so cute. Shivani and I were both nuns together. We were so, just indifferent, and she is. Her name is Shivani. She's Shiva. She's the absolute renunciate. But she's also very comfortable in her own skin. My hair has never turned white. This is my father's genetics. This is who I am. Her hair turned white, but it doesn't look white. I said, Shivani, when we were in our 20s, I would have bet $100 million that you would never color your hair. And she just smiled at me and she said, odd, isn't it? Just like that. No defensiveness, no nothing. Just odd, isn't it? Yeah, it's super odd, but there you are. But I understood. I understood because I felt it too. And I just think to myself, oh my gosh, what an incredible delusion this is, that we actually think it matters. But then when Sri Yukteswar said that most people make a body that's 25, I thought, well, there's some astral pattern there. Because 25 is like, you're fully grown, you've really come into yourself, but you haven't tipped over, you're not disintegrating yet. You start disintegrating, takes a few more years before you start disintegrating. But there's some astral youthful pattern in there that we remember and that we love, I guess. Sri Yukteswar said, because he said he was unusual, because he made himself into an old man. So even in the astral world, he kept his old body instead of making a young body like everyone else did. Now, all of this whole long story, is just so that we will we will really think about this. Who am I? What are the values that I'm following? When I'm just woken up from a dead sleep and somebody asks me who I am, what do I answer? Do I say I am the immortal spirit? Or do I give my name and address, my age, my gender, my, whatever else it might be, my cultural heritage? And what is that except just this that is not the self? And so we might not particularly get any particular pleasure from it, but it comes and goes. And there's nothing, it's not going to give us anything really. The only thing that matters is how we live in terms of our attunement to the divine. Because old age, sickness, and death, that's just the way it is. It's samsara, it's the flow of life. That's why he says, and will bring only misery. I wish he had stated it a little more mildly, but I can't really take issue with him. Another nicer way of saying it would be, it will never bring you the fulfillment you want. He stated it in terms of it'll make you miserable, which it will, because when you put your hope into something that can't return it, what will happen to you? I had such a funny experience. I lived in a different apartment in the same community for 20 years. And at a certain point, we put a new carpet into the apartment. And we had this particular color that we wanted that we couldn't find easily. And so we ordered it from another state, and it was going to come in. And it was this whole thing that was just going on, because our place was a public place, and it needed to have a certain level of refinement, and it needed to be something that would uplift people. So it was an effort worth making. So finally, after after all of this up and down and time and energy, the new carpet was laid, and it was that wonderful thing where the apartment's completely empty, and you wonder why you would ever buy furniture or own anything, because just all that open space is so relaxing to the mind, especially with the new carpet, So I sort of enjoyed the carpet, and I sat on the carpet, and I laid on the carpet, and I looked at the carpet, and I touched the carpet. And the problem was, it was just an inert object. And it could do nothing. It could do nothing at all. The way I thought about it is, no matter how much I love it, it will never love me back. and I just thought, that's really what everything in this world is like. Of course, we have friends, we have relations who do their best to love us back. They do their very best to do it. And there's a great deal of joy that comes from that. But whatever it is, there's always, in the end, who am I? What am I? And where does my happiness come from? I was charmed. Somebody quoted to me yesterday Byron Katie, who's a very fine spiritual teacher, and she's very blunt spoken, and she's very original. I have a lot of respect for what she does. I've never met her, but I know something of her work, and I respect it. And she has a way, just like Krishna does, of turning things on their head. And she said, "Isn't death wonderful? It's the only thing you get to do all by yourself." She said, you get to do it just all by yourself. Nobody can do it for you. Nobody interferes. You get to do it just your own way. I thought, what a marvelous way to put it. For me personally, one of the things that really impelled me onto the spiritual path was a realization I had about death, which was it was inevitable. And when it happened, it wouldn't matter how many children I'd given birth to, how many people loved me. It wouldn't make any difference. There I would be, and I didn't know anything, I didn't have the picture as clear as I have now, but I knew I would be absolutely alone. Even if I was surrounded by people, I would be absolutely alone, and the only thing I would have, and I would be up against who I was without any possibility of escape. And I thought, whoa, that's really important. I have to take that really seriously. I can't just, sort of laugh my way through my whole life. I have to really face into that reality. Now, of course, this has to be past lives. I'm 18 years old, and, this is what's important to me at this point. This is the intuition that there's another reality, and the growing faith that I can do something about it. So Krishna just says flat out that, and in the end will bring only misery. Well, how about that? We can't dismiss it. There's many things that Swami said to me over the years that I didn't understand. I didn't want it to be true. I would go so far as to say in some cases I didn't agree with him, and I absolutely wanted to be right and wanted him to be wrong. But I respected him too much to just disregard it. I just couldn't say, oh, well, you're wrong. I couldn't do that because I had already gained too much faith in the fact that he would tell the truth. But I couldn't take it either. So I just kind of bundle it up and just put it over there. Just put it out of the way, up in the high shelf of the closet, and just keep in front of me what I could work with, and then that would just fester up there. Well, it wouldn't even fester, it would just wait. And I think without exception, every single thing that I couldn't embrace, eventually I have. Because I've just lived long enough and worked hard enough and done what I could to move forward spiritually. And all of a sudden, oh, that's really true. So when Krishna says, in the end will bring only misery, I know he's telling us the truth. And I'm more interested in finding out why what he's saying is true than I am in figuring out how I can repudiate it. So it's not that I believe otherwise, it's just I don't quite know what he means yet. No one of any understanding would seek happiness through them. I absolutely love that line. That has to be one of my favorite lines in the Gita so far. No one of any understanding would ever seek happiness that way. It's sort of like, this is ridiculously small, but Swami Kriyananda's mother was a very, very refined person. And she was a real aristocrat. I mean, not hereditary aristocrat, but she just lived in a very refined world. And we were actually talking one day about silverware, about certain kind of silverware. When her husband, Ray, had a heart attack, I moved in with them. And this was, he was like, they were in their 80s by now. I moved into their house for about 6 weeks until they could make more permanent arrangements. And so I was just in their world, and I was talking about, somehow we were talking about place settings and silverware. And I sort of remember the specific comment was she could never remember having been served fish without a proper fish knife and fork. I think that's how she put it. No, I grew up in such a way as that I didn't even know there was such a thing as a proper fish knife and fork. But to her, that was just like, she couldn't imagine it. Her other marvelous phrase to me was when her niece came to visit once, her grandniece, she just said to me afterwards, I can't imagine raising children without full-time live-in help. Swami grew up with a wonderful nanny, or a nurse, and just like that was just the world, the way the world was to her. So when I hear it, no one of any understanding would ever try to find happiness that way. Oh, for the day when that is so obvious to us, isn't it? Think of the freedom. You see, it's not cynicism, it's freedom. It's like, well, of course that won't make me happy. This is the only thing I want. That's what we're working toward, always. Okay, moving on. Chapter 5, verse 23. He is truly a yogi who, while living on earth and up to the last moment of his earth life, can master every impulse of desire and antipathy. He alone among mortals is a happy human being. Oh, lovely. Now that's lovely. Who can master every impulse of desire and antipathy, likes and dislikes of the heart. See, this is the incredible paradox of God's creation. And this is the most remarkable, this is just so remarkable. What is day to the worldly man is night to the yogi. What is night to the worldly man is day to the yogi. There's just this complete turnaround, because the great yogis, certainly the self-realized masters, the great yogis continue to live in the same world that we're living in. They just perceive it really differently. I was with Swamiji after the first 16 years. I didn't live in the same community that he lived in, and he lived in different parts of the world, so it wasn't, the first 16 years was very close proximity. The last 30, whatever it would be after that, 25 years after that, I was in constant contact with him, but not always physically. But it took me a long time to really, I would say, get a glimmer of sort of what his real perspective on things was. And he was experiencing the same world. You know, he was interacting with people. We would go out to dinner. We would watch movies sometimes. We would laugh. We would have tea together. I would cook for him. We'd have wonderful meals. You know, it's just like we were living in the same world. People were bringing him their troubles. He was empathetic to an extraordinary degree and sympathetic, and his heart just went out to people. I mean, how many times, you know, did he try to save someone from, including me, from certain karmas, and had to just let us learn from our experience. Again, Sri Yukteswar, with the disciple in his ashram, Kumar, whom Sri Yukteswar saw a certain potential in, but the young man went off to be in his village when Sri Yukteswar suggested he not go. And when he came back, he had become coarse and unsuitable for the ashram life. And it broke Sri Yukteswar's heart in a certain very real way. So much so that he had to ask Master to ask Kumar to leave the ashram, because Sri Yukteswar just couldn't bring himself to do it. Because he felt so deeply, the world will have to be his teacher now. So they experience it. I thought for a long time that Swami just somehow had put a shield up. That would be the way I would think about it. But he didn't. He was completely open, just more open than anyone. But he didn't apply his likes and dislikes. He didn't say, I want this to happen, I don't want that to happen. This is the Brahman, the true Brahman, that all I want is the will of God. And the way the will of God manifests is whatever is happening. This is the same that I was saying a moment ago. The woman sort of just with this, you know, a whine that cannot be alleviated. Why? Well, because Divine Mother knows what's best for us. And these are just karmic necessities we have to live through. Now, the Jivan Mukta, and I believe that was Swami, there's no ego to which karma can attach. So he moves through the world freely. The way it's described is unfinished karma may still have to run through. But Mickey Singer, speaking of a different spiritual teacher who found himself in a terrible situation, And as it happened, the teacher was expelled from his own ashram, and Mickey Singer took him in. Michael Singer, he's the author of a couple of best-selling books now about spiritual life. But he talked about watching that teacher have to go through the experience, and the man was a very saintly soul. He said it wasn't so much that the teacher went through a hard time, is that a hard time went through the teacher. Isn't that an interesting way to think about it? Because there was no I to say this is happening to me, but it was happening. You know, the betrayal, the bereft, the confusion, the loss, all of those things were actually taking place, but they were running through him. Rather than, I want this, I don't want that. This is my like, this is my antipathy. I was reflecting recently, because I've had some experiences in the last couple of years that have agitated my emotions. It doesn't take a lot to agitate my emotions. This is a karma that I've lived with. Anybody who knows me can tell you that. I've advanced enormously from where I used to be, but still, my emotions can get agitated. In the last few years, I've had to go through some very confusing situations with people I love. And each time I step a little farther into a place of even-mindedness and calmness about it, I'm so impressed by how agitated I was, even as I thought I was getting free from it. Because, and I don't exactly know if I can say it in words, but every so often I get a feeling for what it would actually be like to really have no likes and dislikes, to be master every impulse of desire and antipathy, which is to say master any impulse that says, I want it to be different. Now that's not the same, you have to understand. That doesn't mean that we passively accept whatever happens. It just means within ourselves, we just accept whatever comes and then respond appropriately to it. And responding appropriately may be strong. Anandamoy Ma, let me think if I can say this correctly. Because somebody challenged her on this, you know, if you're just supposed to accept everything that comes, what if something is coming that's not really right, that's not really dharmic? And she basically said, well, just let them try to get it past me then. I mean, meaning that she had all the power of the universe in her, and she was not going to be passive, but to be centered and to not be allowing yourself to be pushed around by desires and antipathies is quite different. You're centered in yourself, you see what needs to be done, you respond to it. You feel the divine impulse, you respond to it, and no part of you. Swami uses the example of playing tennis. He said if somebody hits the ball and they hit it far from where you're standing, you don't throw your racket down and have a hissy fit because why didn't you hit it right to me? He said because that's the way the game is played, is that you have to run and you have to get there in time to hit it back. You don't just stand there and let it roll past you. But you also don't constantly rebel and cry and whine and protest because it's going to a part of the court where you didn't want to be, where you weren't standing and you don't want to take the trouble to run over there. So Swamiji was so dynamic, and Master was so dynamic and powerful and determined. Swami just made so much happen in his life. I mean, he actually wrote, I think it was in 2012, he was reading about Alfonso X, the King of Spain, who was also a man of many accomplishments, including some 400 pieces of music, mostly in worship of Divine Mother. And historians, some of the history books about him, Alfonso X of Spain, say, oh, he couldn't possibly have done it. He must have put his name on other things. Apprentices must have done the work, and then he took the credit. You know, just all this. So Swami, seeing this, he wrote this document. I have it in my file. I have the original of it. He wrote this document that said, You know, I, Swami Kriyananda, I've done all these books. I've written all these books. I've written all this music. I've founded these communities. I've done these lectures. Every single word, every note, it was exactly what my guru told me to do. Everything I did was absolutely sincere, guided by Yogananda, and I did it myself. It even went so far as to say, some people say that Alfonso X didn't do it himself, but I believe that I was him and he did too. No, I'm paraphrasing the language. It was more elegant than that. But he took the trouble to write it down. And one of the tremendous secrets of Swami's extraordinary creativity is that he mastered every impulse of desire or antipathy. And so there was no energy wasted. This is simply what needs to be done. I remember just jokingly, I don't remember what exactly was going on. It might have been during the 12 years of litigation, or it just could have been the general kerfuffle that was always going on around Swami. In the midst of all that, he goes to the dentist, and he comes back and he says that he has no cavities. And I just made one of the stupid jokes for which I was notorious. I just said, well, thank the Lord for little favors, is what I said, which is just a cliche. It means that I don't even know what it means, but it was like, well, at least you don't have any cavities. Swami, absolute, complete, he didn't crack a smile, nothing. He was stern. He was completely stern. I thank Divine Mother for everything she sends. Even just as a flippant remark like that, he wouldn't take it. He wouldn't let it happen. And I saw him repeatedly. Whenever you would say anything, oh, why does Divine Mother treat you that way? I am grateful for everything she sends. And just now again, just start watch your energy. Watch how often, speaking for myself, I won't speak for you, but ask yourself the question, have I mastered every impulse of desire and antipathy? You know, and each time you move out of it a little bit, just like I was saying, this couple of years of cycle that I've been going through, each time I get a little more centered, which, thank you God, the direction is toward being more centered, all of a sudden I realize, wow, there's a long ways to go on this, isn't there? But here it says, this is he alone among mortals. So we're talking about human life. He who can master the impulse toward desire and antipathy, he alone among mortals is a happy human being. This is a nice balance to no one of any understanding would be drawn to that. So, chapter 5, stanza number 24. Only one who possesses inner bliss, who is firmly centered in the inner self, and who is illumined by the inner light. Isn't that a beautiful phrase? To be illumined by the inner light, dependent for his understanding on nothing outside of the self, the divine self, attains complete liberation both while he lives and after death. Only one who possesses inner bliss, who is firmly centered in the inner self, and who is illumined by the inner light, dependent for his understanding on nothing outside the self, attains complete liberation both while he lives and after death. What extraordinary promises the Gita offers us. It's just like, this is really worth doing. This is something that when once attained, you really have something. Swami was fond of quoting Howard Hughes in the last weeks of his life. He was one of the richest people in the world. And people say, well, you've attained all this wealth. Are you happy? And Swami would always imitate the sound of the man's voice. No, I can't say that I'm happy. You know, it's like, and the Swami said the mere sound of his voice just told you. So he put all this energy into acquiring all this stuff, and he was about to die. And the old phrase, you can't take it with you. I mean, you take yourself with you, which is the really scary part. but both while he lives and after death. It was very interesting with Swamiji in the last years of his life because his physical health just disintegrated, but his spirit just became freer and freer. By the last, couple of years of his life, he could still walk, but to go any real distance, and by the end he had Shurja on one side and Narayani on the other, and they would just sort of move his body from place to place. As soon as he would sit down, though, and didn't have to use it in that way, his face became, let me say, illumined by the inner light. And he looked young. He looked just youthful. He looked ageless is actually the right word. He did not look elderly. When he stood up and had to move his body, there was no mistaking him for anything but a very elderly man. But as soon as it was just his consciousness, you couldn't put an age on it. He just was what he was. Now, Swamiji had a profound level of vairagya. And vairagya is a marvelous word, and it means disinclination for the things of the world. It's translated into English, it's a very subtle definition, a disinclination. I don't have an aversion, I don't hate it, but I'm not inclined toward it either. I've mastered, it doesn't serve to hate the world, because then you're caught on that side too. But vairagya is just a profound disinclination for this world. And Swami would often sort of, at different times, he had different moods. But there was a period of time when he was eager to be done with this planet, with this plane of consciousness. And on one notable occasion, I was with him. We were actually sitting in a restaurant. Swami was also, again, very refined and had what you would say, he had wonderful manners. He had elegant manners. And I was talking about early Dwapara Yuga, which is the age of the planet we're living in, early Dwapara Yuga, and how truly ghastly the consciousness is at this point. We were talking about the movies or something, and this was a conversation of 30 years ago when I want to use the word Satan was just getting warmed up in terms of the horrendous material that is put out now as entertainment. But it was enough. My friend Devarshi said to me once, I think it was the movie, it might have been the movie, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which I know is sort of a joke, but I think there actually is a movie with that name in it. And there are lots of other movie titles that are really terrible. And I remember very cheerfully Devarshi saying once, imagine a planet in which they make movies like that, and imagine we're living on it. You just sort of think, what kind of a world is this? Who would do that on purpose? No one of any understanding would want to do that, but they do. And now, just like each one has to top the one before. It's really stunning. So I was having this conversation with Swami about how coming to Earth, coming to this plane of consciousness, to a planet that was at this stage of the Yuga cycle, I said to him, if we're going to come again, sir, why don't we wait for a higher age? Why don't we wait for a really elevated age? And then at least it won't be as bad as this. And Swami had a mouthful of sandwich. He'd just taken a bite of his sandwich, and with it still in his mouth, because he had to say it really fast, I don't intend ever to come back. He said just like that, forcefully. And then he went and said more, which was interesting. He said, even when the planet is in the most elevated yuga, it's still the material plane, is how he put it. It's still this battle between the senses reaching out and the effort to live within. He said, however, he said, in the higher ages, people like us are in charge. So I said, so like the whole world just operates like Ananda? He said, yes. With trust, with friendship, with an understanding of the real purpose of life. So it could be more pleasant, but he said very emphatically it's still the material plane. And so there were times when Swami went through this real, like, once I'm free, because Master promised him he would become a siddha. Siddha. He would be completely free. Master said, at the end of this lifetime, you will be completely free. He said, Master actually said to Swami, you're already self-realized. I don't understand what all this really means, but you're already self-realized. You're just not aware of it. I came down to Jivan Mukta. He had Master just said, you have all this work you have to do. And I watched Swamiji. I watched him. Well, I'll come back to that in just a moment. But at a certain point, Swami realized that he was trying to dictate the hour of his death, meaning he was trying to repudiate this world in such a way that he was allowing himself to succumb to desires and antipathies. And he realized that that was not the right attitude. What difference did it make? Whether he was still in that body, whether he was somewhere else, it's all the same. It's just, that is the great confusing secret of this whole thing, is that all of this diversity, all of these choices, all of these ups and downs, they're all just an illusion. There's only ever one reality. Master Swami writes about how when Master, after he'd been recording this chanting album, and he was very moved by all of the devotion, and he said to the monks who were with him, if you could see yourselves as I see you, you would realize that you are nothing but beautiful light, just beautiful light. And so Master would just look out at this whole world, and all he would see was beautiful light, just in all these different forms. And he would respond appropriately. But the people he was looking at identified with something other than the self. And so now, toward the end of Swami's life, in many different ways, this was a conversation I had with him. He was living in Italy. Yes, in the last years, just before he went to India in 2003. And his health was not so good. Swami worked out a lot of Ananda's karma, and I believe a lot of our karma, on his body. He said as much. It wasn't his own karma that he was working out, so his body was constantly going through things, because he was using his body to work out karma for many different things. And so his heart had become very weak, and he was in Italy. I was talking to him on the phone, and he was saying that his heart had just become so weak, and the life force had become so small. The way Swami put it was, I could have just slipped out of the body so easily. Just like I was barely held into it. Now, of course, I know Swami would die at some point, but I wasn't looking forward to it. And several things, let me think. Oh, I said to him, you've already long since completed the great work that Master wanted you to do. So it would be absolutely selfish of me to even suggest that you should stay in that body if the door opens. We want you to be free. But then I said, but it won't be any fun to be on this planet after you go. Swami answered me so sweetly. And speaking of, he was 25 when Master died. He'd been with him for 3 years. He and Master were going to go to India. And then instead Master left his body. Swami was 25 years old. So when I said, it won't be any fun to be on this planet without you, Swami very seriously said, I know, I've been through it. Just like that. And then either in that conversation or a different one, Swami was saying something about how he'd come to realize that even, his determination not to reincarnate, he said, I know myself. He said, I'll come back to help all of you. And I said to him, well, sir, that's the only reason you came this time, isn't it? He said, well, yes, there is that. Just like that. But that compassion, that understanding that it's all going to end in misery and somebody has to come back to help us know. But still, where I want to go at the very end of this, in the last years of Swami's life, especially after Narayani came into his life, which was whatever that period was, she was with him. She knew him for 10 years, so starting around 2003. Because she took over a lot of responsibilities for his life. That's why she was significant. She just sort of became his face to the world. And then when she married Shurjo at the very end, Shurjo too. But Swami just let go and let the bliss come in. So he lived so much in such a blissful state at the end, and he would it all turned into exactly what the Gita is talking about, which is it just all turned into bliss. Now, I always experienced him that way. And at the beginning of the book Light Bearer, it just starts like that, a conversation between Swamiji and that Swamiji and I had in 2011 when he was living in Los Angeles. I said, sir, people ask me if you've changed since I've known you. And I said, I tell them, your consciousness has always been the same since the first minute I saw you, 1969. But you veiled your consciousness for many, many years, and it took intuition to break through it. I said, now you don't see you're not veiled. And so the consciousness of who you are just shows. And I said, can I say that? Because sometimes things would be true and he still wouldn't let me say it. Or sometimes, well, no, I was rarely wrong. I was hardly ever wrong. I said, may I say that? He said, oh yes, he said, because it's true. So there was some, just Leela that goes on between the inner world, the outer world, the necessity that we're living. It's true also of us. When we know ourselves, and I'll talk about this more next week because it's in the verses, when we know ourselves, when we go into meditation or in some way it opens up, it's not like it's not like we've acquired something. It's exactly the word realize. We've just realized something. And when you realize something, it's not new. It's just been, you've not known it. So all of these descriptions of these illuminated from the inner light, all of it, it's not distant in time. It's not distant in space. It's not distant. We're just not aware of it yet. Isn't that interesting? It's just so marvelous to contemplate. Swamiji said to us once, at the end of a really inspired satsang, he looked out at all of us and he said, you're going to get it right sooner or later. He said, why waste a few million years? I don't know, sir. Why would we do that? Good question. God bless you, my friend.